Okay, Madam Chair, we are recording and broadcasting. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Welcome to the Delta Independent Science Board meeting of March 3rd. This is a relatively brief meeting to handle some business between our regular meetings. And so welcome everybody. And I'd like to quickly give an overview of the public comment process. For those participating remotely, we take written questions and comments. You can email your public comments to the email shown. Indicate if it's about a particular agenda item so that we can schedule you at the right time. And if you prefer to make oral comments, use the raised hand function in Zoom or send an email about the agenda item you'd like to speak to. And then afterwards, wait until you're prompted for a public comment. And then when you are speaking, feel free to introduce yourself by stating your name and affiliation. Okay, now back to the board. We're going to do roll call. Please state your name and if you have any new declarations. Steve.
Steve Brandt, nothing new.
Virginia.
Virginia Dale, no new declarations.
Tanya.
Tanya Heikela, no new declarations.
Tom.
Tom Holzer, no new declarations.
Anna.
Anna McCluck, no new declarations.
And we'll just note that Anna has to leave at 11. Diane.
Diane McKnight, no new declarations.
Bob.
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
Obey.
Jayanta Obey-Sekara, no new declarations.
And Lisa Wanger, no new declarations. And Inga Werner is not able to join us today. All right, which is too bad because she led one of the things we're going to talk about, but that's all right. We can manage. So really our agenda is pretty simple. We're going to rediscuss our the environmental impact statement review and see if we've adequately responded to people's concerns. And then there's a potential action. Well, hang on. And then the other thing, so there's two reviews we're discussing today. One is the environmental impact statement for the Delta Conveyance Project. One is the draft scientific basis report supplement for the voluntary agreements. And based on the discussion, we may take potential action for completing these two reviews. And that's really the bulk of the agenda. During our last public meeting, we received a few written comments to be read into the meeting record, and these are now part of your public correspondence, along with additional correspondence received since the last meeting. And we did get quite a bit of correspondence from the California Water Research, from Bob Wright, from the Bay Institute and others, the Tuolumne River Trust, Penelope Lapone, and I apologize if I say anyone's name wrong, Karen Jacques, Lionel Mares, and Joe Coffey. So those are all in your packet for you to review. And I'll just pause here and see if there are any public comments.
There are none.
Great. Okay. Well, then we'll move into our first discussion, which is of the environmental impact statement review.
Hold on. I just saw a raised hand.
Okay.
With Deirdre Dan.
Okay. Let's take Deirdre's comment.
Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
Part of your packet is a long and unfortunately somewhat technical synthesis of recent research on climate dynamics. And the core of it is that there's been a 20-year trend toward a La Nina-like pattern in the tropical Pacific. And the rest of the Pacific is warming, but there's a cold tongue, and that's shown up repeatedly. And the climate models, it's on the very edge of what the climate models capture, and none of the coupled model intercomparison project phase 5 models that DWR is using capture this pattern at all. And there's some new research that they were able to do large ensemble models where you use a supercomputer and you run a climate model multiple times, and you're able to better sample the internal variability of the models. And that's showing that the models really don't capture this, and it's a subject of very intense research and debate, and it means that the uncertainty about the mega drought ending is much greater. There is some new research that shows it could be caused by greenhouse gas forcing, in which case it could be a transient response, in which case we could be in a La Nina-like pattern for another 30 to 80 years. And it is tied also to California precipitation. I cited some of the research. I ran across some more, but it just means we're operating under huge uncertainty right now. And we're starting to realize with this large ensemble some of the other limitations in the climate models, like not capturing the basin coupling between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, which is a really major feedback. So I tried to capture some of that. Richard Seeger, who is the lead scientist for the California Drought Attribution Study, is now saying we need to have a scenario approach for which based on observations. So I tried to pull some of that together. They did do a scenario approach for the 4th California climate assessment, where they looked at a 20-year drought. So it's beyond the scope of the reviews you're doing, but I tried to, there's a huge literature to synthesize, and I went through, I went closely through about 600 papers to pull this together, and there's still more to trace. But I think it's just really important. And I tried to make the explanation accessible to people who had some scientific and technical background, but weren't necessarily experts in tropical ocean dynamics, for instance, or climate models. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Deirdre, for helping us stay current with that literature. And I'm sure you know this is a topic of great interest to us. We don't plan to drop this issue of, how is climate change being represented and used in decision making. So we'll keep that conversation going. Thank you. Okay, now let's move on to our discussion of the environmental impact statement. And so on December 16th, we submitted our final review of the environmental impact report for the Delta Conveyance Project to DWR. And that was the same day the Corps of Engineers released their environmental impact statement for that same project. And that's the comments for that are due, the public comment period is due March 16th. At our last meeting, we discussed our draft review of that EIS, which was a very abbreviated review, given that we just didn't have much time to respond. And based on the discussion and the public comments received, we agreed to revise that and then rediscuss it here today. So hopefully you've all had a chance to take a look at that new comment letter, and now we need to decide if we have addressed changes adequately. So the main changes that were made since the last version was to add comments about harmful algal blooms and environmental justice. 2, to clarify the comments related to climate change. We had thought that climate change might have been integrated more thoroughly, but upon rereading, we think perhaps it was just better explained. Some things were better explained. And so we clarified our language. And then we also clarified that the EIS refers to a 100-year maintenance schedule, which confirms that it really does have this long planning horizon, working horizon, which makes it appropriate to think more long-term about climate change and other issues. And we rewrote the topic sentences to better emphasize our main points, since we were burying the lead, apparently. So the question to you all now is, are there points you want to say whether they were adequately captured? Is there anything still missing? and how comfortable are folks in going ahead with this version, or making minor adjustments after this so we can finalize it. We'd be ultimately looking for content approval at this meeting if folks are comfortable. But first, let's just hear from everybody if they are satisfied with how the changes were addressed. Got a thumbs up from Bob, thumbs up from Tanya. Didn't Virginia, were there some comments though that needed to be entered into the record? Diane gives a thumbs up. Virginia, if you're talking, you're muted. Bob, let's start with Bob.
Okay. Let's see, Lisa, I thought the writing team did a very nice job in incorporating the suggestions that we had made at the last meeting. And I offered a couple of word changes, but I did have one question though, and it has to do with topic number 5, which says that there are some differences between the EIR and the EIS. And my only suggestion would be, and it's a very minor one, is I wonder in parentheses if we could just put in a couple of examples of what the differences might be, just so that it would be clear to readers kind of outside the ISB as to what we mean by this. So anyway, very minor suggestion, but that's it for me. Other than that, I thought it read very well.
Yeah, and we did receive some comments that at least some of those differences were in some of the social science impacts, but I do think we have the feeling that it's just scattered, and they just didn't really explain how they came to different conclusions. If they had just laid out what their decision process was very clearly, it would have been more clear. At least that's my understanding. So Obey and Tom, I'm going to keep you in the queue, but did anyone have a comment specifically about this, or can they provide any examples? I don't see any raised hands. I think the problem is it was just something that several folks noticed as they were reading through, and they didn't take note of exactly where it was happening. So I'm afraid we may not have more to offer, but I suspect the Corps of Engineers knows where they differed. So I'm afraid, I don't know if we can, Steve, is your comment to this point or something else?
No, that's fine.
This point, and it seems to me in point number 5, there are 2 elements there. One has to do with the covering of terrestrial species not evaluated in the EIR. There's additional terrestrial species. I think that's pretty clear. I think this Virginia pointed this out, but I think that I don't know if you need any examples there, because that part of it is clear. It seems to me where an example might be useful was in the second part of that sentence that had to do with the social economic conclusions.
Yeah, okay. Well, we can see if that can be filled in. But I think right now we don't have it, and I don't think anyone has an example. Anna, did you want to talk to this issue?
I did. I wonder if the way to thread this needle is, rather than have us try to find the differences, we could potentially reword that 5th point to say that we would encourage them to explicitly list out both differences in scope, for lack of a better word, like the terrestrial species that are discussed here, and any differences in conclusions for items that are covered in both reports. So rather than us finding the differences, we can tell them that because these 2 documents will both be, out in the public record, that it behooves them to have an outline of these 2 types of items that we call out in item 5.
I like that suggestion very much, and that's in keeping with what I said. They're going to know, but we would have
exactly.
It would be a lot of work for us to find them.
It's not for us to figure it out. And,
yeah.
And honestly, in some cases, it's possible that they haven't quite gone to the point of looping back and seeing what the differences are, and doing that may engender some additional thinking on their part as well.
strong point. Let's go with that unless other folks have problems with that. We'll wait to hear. Meanwhile, let's go on to Obe's comment. Obe, you're muted.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we are looking at the February 28th version, right? That's the date on the most recent. I provided some comments on the previous version. I think they were included in this version. I see that. I just want to be clear. Earlier we said they had extended analysis to 2100, but I think now we are not saying that we can't find any additional analysis to extend the results from the EIR analysis to 2100. And I think the current draft does not say that, there have been some additional look at up to 2100. So I think I'm okay with that, with the current language. I just read it again. So,
okay, good. Yeah, that was our intent to clarify that, they were just clearer about which climate projections had been used in which cases, and it wasn't really representing new analysis. It just was,
Yeah, and I think they had a major conclusion that the climate change did not seem to have any impact, and I think we indicated that in here as well. So I think that's also good. We were
right,
not
for
sure.
specifically for the alternatives. Yeah, they'd laid out a lot of potential changes, but then they said the alternatives wouldn't have anything much different from the baseline.
All right, thanks. That's all.
Thank you, Obe. Yeah, I do think we captured that. Yeah. Okay, Tom.
Okay, can we see point 8 or 7? I forget which one. The last one. There we go. Yeah, that last sentence. I suggested rewriting that sentence, and the issue is, although I'm not an expert on tunnel boring machines, it's my understanding that they put the liners when they're boring through soft soils, they put the liners in very quickly, so that there's not a lot of exposed tunnel to cause settlements and affect the levees. And I think the issue is more that they just don't talk about it, rather than, as this implies, that there might be problems. I suspect there are not problems of settlements with these tunnel boring machines just because of the way they do it. So I submitted a rewrite of that sentence
to be more clear that it's about missing information instead of a likely risk.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That why don't we stick with that then? Mm-hmm. I hear what you're saying. Okay, great. Do we have any other major points? Okay, seems like we're in pretty good agreement then that this version can hold up and stand as our review. We do, of course, point to our EIR review, which is much more thorough and detailed, as most of those points applying to this document as well. And the main differences being that this document was a little more streamlined and a little easier to read and understand in a few ways. So, but since they did rely on the same analyses, there is, almost all of our substantive conclusions from the EIR apply to the EIS as well. So do I have a motion to accept this? Let's see, what is the actual motion we're looking for? To approve the content of the letter and submit to the Corps of Engineers by the comment period deadline after making the change that Tom suggested.
And I think rewording item 5 as well, correct?
Oh, right, and rewriting item 5, thank you. Yes, Edmund would have kept me straight even though I didn't say it. Motion.
I move to accept the content of the letter with those changes and submit to the Corps of Engineers.
Thank you, Tanya. Do I have a second?
I second.
Thanks, Diane. Okay, and now we'll do a roll call vote.
No, public comment, sorry.
Oh, sorry, now we'll do public comments. Okay, sorry, good.
Yeah, so we have one from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. And for anyone who has public comments, feel free to use the raise hand function or email us at disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. Thank you.
Just Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. I just wanted to say I really appreciate asking for things to be clarified. And with your background, if it's not clear to you, it's really not clear to NGO staff who are trying to dig through this huge document and comment on the analysis. And I often see this as a way of obfuscating points. The whole underpinnings of DWR's central tendency projection from the climate models was obscured by referring to other documents and analyses that weren't even publicly posted anywhere. And so it really is a part of best available science that they have to clearly convey the assumptions and the analyses. So I very much support that, and it's very helpful to come from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. We appreciate that comment. Okay, or do we have any other public comments?
Yep, no additional public comments.
Okay, so now we will move to the roll call vote. So Steve.
Yes, I vote aye.
Do you approve the motion?
I approve.
Thanks. Virginia. Sorry, what happened to Virginia? She did say they're having extreme storms in her neck of the woods. It could be that her power or internet just went out. So too bad we didn't get to her before she disappeared, but we will check back with her. Tanya.
I approve.
Tom.
I approve.
Anna.
I approve.
Diane.
I approve.
Bob.
I approve.
Obey.
I approve the motion.
And Lisa here, I approve. Still no Virginia. Okay, well, even without Virginia, we have a quorum, so the motion passes. And now we are able to move on to our next topic of discussion. So the other document that's on the same timeline that we need to get comments in as soon as possible is the draft scientific basis report supplement for the voluntary agreements. On January 5th, the State Water Resources Control Board released this draft report, and it covers the Sacramento River, Delta, and Tributaries, and it's an update to the San Francisco Bay, Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Water Quality Control Plan. And although the board did not formally request Delta ISB review, we felt it was within our purview, and there was interest to complete a review given our responsibilities to provide scientific oversight of adaptive management in the Delta. And so as a follow-up to the January meeting, I got in touch with the water board and indicated that we plan to review this and asked about how it might be most useful. They said that getting comments by the end of February could still be useful, even though it was past the public comment period. But getting anything too late would create problems with their process and might not get incorporated. They didn't give us any particular areas of emphasis, just said use our expertise. And so based on the public discussion in February, Dr. Nyman and others prepared a draft review. So Steve and I helped and others, I think that's the main people who contributed. And so now we've provided this draft that is ready to be potentially be finalized for submission. You know, we are on a tight timeline. So before we get into the discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who's going to provide an overview of the content of that review.
Great, thanks, Lisa. As Lisa said, I'll give you a brief overview of the content of our report. And this is mostly, I guess, for folks who are on the line here who didn't have a chance to see, what the report contains. But it should be noted, just before I start, that the ISB did do a review of the State Water Resources Board report for the scientific basis in 2017. And we raised some concerns at that time that had to do with unimpaired flow, cold water management, non-flow stressors, climate change, adaptive management, and so forth. And in that 2017 report, it was also sent out to 5 external reviewers, who, at least in our opinion, were very well qualified to provide comments on the scientific basis in 2017. So it's also worth noting that because of the abbreviated time that we had to look at the existing documents, we were not able to, and probably shouldn't anyway, look into legal or social issues. And these are not addressed in this or any of our previous reviews, even though, we consider them to be vitally important. We just tried to focus entirely on the science in the reports and the scientific process that they followed. So, as many of us would probably note, in recent years, both individuals and institutions have become very adept at using the key words that we all want to hear, things like temperature, statistical design, adaptive management, uncertainty, and so forth. And I think one of the things that the ISB is particularly good at is looking behind these words to see if there is this, I would say, the scientific process or the literature, the evidence, to really support what individuals or institutions say that they're going to do. And so we looked at these documents in that light, and in the sense that was enough information provided that we as a board could feel reasonably confident that the State Water Resources Control Board would be able not only to do what they say they're going to do, but be successful, reasonably successful in pulling it off. So the voluntary agreements offered in these documents are offered as a potential alternative to flow standards that would be imposed by state agencies on water users. And it was, I guess, very gratifying, at least for me, that the MOU outlines terms for an 8-year program that would provide both flow and non-flow improvements to restore aquatic habitat. And it also provided the details, or they provided the details of the funding for implementation, for monitoring, water purchases, and so forth. So the ISB in our report, I think, will highlight that we fully understand that this is going to be a very complex undertaking by a state agency or agencies. And any comments that we might have, which I will get to in a minute, are really geared towards trying to improve the process and help ensure that eventually these voluntary agreements are going to be successful, not only in the initial 8-year program, but really for the long term. So we have a number of general comments, both on the scientific report itself, as well as the MOU, which I think we should really consider as being part of that scientific report. And we felt, at least in the scientific, scientific supplement, is that the methods and the modeling approaches are described very well, and generally with adequate detail and transparency. And the conclusions that the agency reaches are based on quantitative modeling that's coupled with hydrodynamic and operational models to show how flow-dependent habitat and abundance models can be can be melded, to provide reasonable outcomes. Now, with that said, the documents also admit in their final chapter that the modeling and the quantitative analysis that they describe are only expected benefits, and the actual outcomes of the voluntary agreements are not certain at this time. And I think, as we'll find, that there's probably some level of concern about whether those the voluntary agreements will actually, be successful in the long term. So the ISB has some general comments that that are being put forward in this report, and probably the most, the most positive aspect of the report that we found is their plan for adaptive management. They state that they want to use structural decision support processes and use this to determine, or adjust flow and non-flow measures going forward. And this allows them to, not only, or they're proposing to do direct science, but they can incorporate the outcomes of testable hypotheses to continue to inform the decision-making, adjust on the fly, and be consistent with provisions of the Conveyance program that is being proposed. And there are funds specifically allocated for adaptive management in this process. So that being said, that overall, I think you'll find that our report is very positive towards the voluntary agreements, but we do have some concerns, some overarching concerns. And there's 4 that are overarching that we would hope that the state agency or agencies would pay particular attention to. The first one has to do with the adaptive management plan. And we would like to just be sure that all the necessary elements are in there for having an effective plan. And the document as it describes it now really lacks some desirable details for assuring a thorough and rigorous approach to promoting the ecosystem benefits here. Now, we feel that and this was not done, at least we could not find it in the documents so far, but defining the performance measures quantitatively and doing an assessment of these quantitative performance measures will be critical both in the near term and in the long run. The second major concern that we have is whether there is a sufficiently robust framework for developing the quantitative metrics that are used to assess performance and to inform adaptive management. And the ISB is going to strongly encourage the agencies to develop what we call SMART objectives. And SMART, by that we mean specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound for all of their actions and the hypotheses associated with some of the site-specific actions that'll take place under the terms of the MOUs. And we feel it's essential that this be done before the MOUs are actually signed. The third overarching concern is that the agencies or the documents say that they will have a scientific team put in place, an 8-person scientific team for evaluation and kind of shepherding the whole process through. But they don't say who will be on that team or what the mix of expertise will be. And it doesn't say when that team will actually be formed. It may be in place now, but it's not clear if it's now or if it's sometime in the future. The ISB feels that this team should be in place absolutely from the beginning, because many of the actions that are being proposed, like the statistical design, the monitoring program, and data management, which I'll discuss in a minute, are really critical components, and it requires having a team in place right from the beginning. And then finally, our fourth overarching concern relates to having concrete plans for data management, analysis, and synthesis. And we feel that one of the really strong points or strong components of the VAs has to do with having the scientific team, which will either is formed now or will be formed, to conduct an ecological assessment in year 7. And given this, the fact that this is going to occur, it would be nice to see more details today about how data will be managed, as well as its integrity, as well as the statistical design. For example, it's not clear if reference sites will be used, or will the agreements rely on a before or after analysis. They're just basic things like this that are really missing from the narratives, and it would be useful to have those in front of us so that we could comment on them. Because these are really essential scientific details that need to be established right from the get-go if you're going to have a successful program in the long term. Now, in our report, in our review, we also have other suggestions and questions on a number of other topics, and you can read those here. But there are basically 5 areas. One relates to monitoring. The second one has to do with how uncertainty is treated and how conclusions are formed. The third one would relate to having how you might address limiting factors, water quality, including harmful algal blooms and other environmental drivers. And the fourth being climate change and its implications for the long term on how it might affect site-specific projects or activities on the individual rivers. And then finally, we have some editorial and technical comments that the agencies might wish to consider. So in ending, though, we've tried to couch these in a very positive way, because I think overall, what the agency is embarking upon here is really a truly complex and just a grand experiment, a grand challenge experiment going forward. Voluntary agreements have had mixed success in other regions of the United States and Canada, but they seem to have, I would say, the bones of a potentially successful program here. But if it can be structured correctly right from the beginning, it probably has a very good chance of eventual success. Not meaning it's going to be smooth all the way, but there are going to be some bumps along the road. But with the adaptive management process in place, quantitative goals, and all the things that are needed to make this successful, including the people being in place, it's going to be a very interesting experiment to follow over the next few years. So anyway, that's a brief overview. And if folks have any comments at all on the content or the tone, whatever you'd like to say, I'm all ears. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And I will just add, because I didn't clarify it in my intro, that there really are 2 documents that are reviewed. And so you'll see that referred to the Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is where the adaptive management plan details are laid out. And so that's really a review of a separate document. And then we're calling the scientific basis report, we're calling that the scientific supplement. So in shorthand. So hopefully that's clear. Okay, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, my comment addresses the request for a comment on tone. And the letter refers to authors 16 times when it's referring to the report. And strictly speaking, the report doesn't have authors. If you look at the title page, it says it's prepared by 3 state agencies. And there's no, I mean, there could be a variety of ways the report came together. And so I noticed in the beginning, I think it's like line 5 in the report, we indicate we will refer to the report as the scientific supplement. And I think you could just substitute that for authors and it would read perfectly fine. And it would also mean that the comments are less personal. We're commenting on the report rather than on what authors did. So I would just recommend that substitution, which can be done quite easily.
Thanks, John. That's a good suggestion. And others feel okay about that? All right. Okay, thumbs up all the way around. Great, thank you.
Good.
Obey. Oh. You just wanted to, okay, you just wanted to just express support. Okay.
Yeah.
Tom, did you have another comment or are you done? It's a test of whether you know how to lower your hand. Okay, Diane, go ahead.
So one of my comments that I didn't contribute until late last night was that some in the scientific basis report, it's these rivers, tributaries and such are sort of described as HABs-free ecosystems, that they're not, we aren't provided information. We have information about water hyacinth as an invasive plant and some of these other details, but we aren't given information. There's not information about which of these may now be experiencing some frequency of HABs or no HABs at all. And this would enter into an adaptive management concern because of highlighting temperature. We know that, or can expect that by mitigating the high temperatures, which is listed in the table as a benefit for disease, we might also mitigate the occurrence of HABs, where higher temperatures can promote because higher temperatures can promote the growth of the cyanobacteria. So, certainly this has been an issue that has become more to the forefront since 2017, and it's not being presented in the same level of detail as some of these other issues that are listed under other stressors. So I added that in as an editorial comment towards the end of what I submitted, but I'm not sure that's where it goes. And, it would take some investigation to know which of these tributaries is this a concern. Maybe it's not a concern right now for any, but I just wanted to put it out there since there is a connection to the flow temperature relationships.
I think that's great, Diane. Yeah. I'm wondering, let me just, Tom, Rob, I'll give you a chance to respond, but this seems a little bit parallel to our concern about climate change and species interactions, basically what's not thought about in the report. So possibly we could link it to those conversations where we're talking about like, yeah, this looks like a good plan, but maybe some other things need to be thought about as well. You're muted, Diane.
Jumping in to agree with that approach and sort of generally pointing out that there's these robust models, but if the models don't include some process that's important, then that can undermine the efficacy of those models for adaptive management.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Bob, did you want to say anything?
I say I agree with what Diane has to say, and I looked at your comments before we started this morning, and I think they're right on, and I can blend those in quite easily into the document. And also, Inga had brought this up on the sections that she had submitted, and I had edited earlier, and maybe I had edited out a little bit on HABs that I should have left in, but her comments on temperature regimes are ones that I can go back and revisit and probably blend it in there as well. So anyway, easy to do, and we'll get it done.
I have one little comment about tones since I don't see. Oh, Steve, you go ahead because you should talk.
Yeah, every time I read our evolving review and every time I go back and read the supplement and so forth, I come up with new wrinkles and new ideas, which is probably not a good thing when we have some sort of a deadline. So I almost hesitate to say what I'm about to say, but it seems the one of the fundamental science challenges in this whole thing is to balance the impact versus the impact of habitat restoration. And I think that there's a lot of talk about changing flows and their impact on some species. Some cases good, some cases bad. More flow is good, flows or less flow is bad. And there's of course the assumption that increased acreage of habitat somehow improves a species production. Particularly true in the case of salmon, where they're trying to do a doubling. The goal is a doubling of production, and one of the measures is a doubling of acreage in terms of spawning or rearing acreage, with the assumption that that somehow is a limiting factor and will therefore improve salmon production. We don't know that that's the case. I think one could argue that I think fairly strongly that the science required to do what they're trying to do is not available, and I think that that's okay. And they do point out some of the limitations that available in the science, and I almost think it should be stated explicitly that the quantitative capability to do what they're trying to do, to predict the relative impacts of flow and habitat acreage in this case to production, given the other environmental drivers, wet years, dry years, temperature, climate change, and so forth, that the science really isn't there. One could outline a model, sort of a life cycle model with these environmental drivers in, and that could be used to address this question. They don't go that far to say what would we really need to be able to address it adequately. I think it's okay if the science is not there, as long as one specifies the assumptions clearly that are being made. We don't know the balance of these, therefore we're assuming this and we're assuming that. It's kind of in there somewhere, but because they have an uncertainty section, but when you read the other sections, it looks like those assumptions somehow are just not clearly stated. We are assuming that increasing the spawning acreage by 25% relates directly to increasing 25% of the production of a salmon. This really comes into play when you're trying to look at the adaptive management and performance measures, that when you are trying to evaluate performance measures, in your adaptive management framework, what are they? And you really need a model to make those predictions of what you're gonna, what might be changing, or if they change outside of your threshold level, what could be driving it. So I feel that I understand what they're trying to do. I think a lot of the science that's out there, are they using? Is the science out there sufficient enough to do this? Probably not. But they could do it within a certain bounds on it, and so it just gives me an uneasy feeling. I also have the same thing when I think about the monitoring, and they're trying to measure changes in production. They can certainly measure changes in acreage, but when you get to performance measure where you're changing the doubling of salmon production, I'm not even sure if they know what the production is. They might, but to measure its changing in that production as caused by actions that are being taken as part of VA, relative to all the other things that are driving production, I don't know that they're there yet. And I think certainly when you get to other species where there's far less information, far less full life cycle modeling being done, you get further out on the fringe of being able to make testable predictions. Bob said it, I think, early on, or maybe it's still in our latest version, about this being a grand experiment. And I think taking it in that context is not a bad thing, and particularly if one could develop an overall, even conceptual model of how the system might work and where the drivers might be and what you're tweaking, And therefore, at the end of the experiment, in 7 or so years, you'll have some idea of whether you were successful or not with the experiment, or whether it was a proper test. But without that modeling framework, I'm not sure you'll get that far. And maybe we ought to suggest that. Maybe it's already in there, Bob. I don't know, that there is some framework that they're working under that would be evolve as the data come in. Anyway, that's my babbling.
Steve, let me see if I can boil down your comments. So I think you're making two main points here, that there's some issues with whether they're really going to be able to measure what they want to measure. And then even if they measure it, they might not be able to interpret the signal unless they have a model that brings in other stressors and drivers. So if you agree, I would suggest we add, and Bob can be the expert on exactly what's in the text right now, but it seems to me that some of your concerns are addressed by the comments we've already made about having the right people in place to really treat this like an adaptive management experiment. So that, yes, I think we all agree the science is insufficient, and therefore the only way to move forward is with an adaptive management experiment. But the really key point that you're making is, even after you measure a bunch of stuff, you may get unintended results, and you may not be able to interpret them because there's so many stressors in the system. So is that going to cover your comments if we add something like that? And maybe we should let Bob speak before you answer me, rather. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, Lisa, I believe both you and Steve are absolutely right. The issue that Steve has brought up, and I agree with him, is that, but this is a conversation that has gone on for probably more than a half a century around salmon. And that's just salmon just being, one fish group, let alone all the other kind of functional forms of wildlife that are out there. Is that basically we just don't know. Some of the things, we can think of lots of reasons why they're going to fail. I can think of dozens just off the top of my head why they should fail. But I think what they're doing is they're starting off on a new tack with these voluntary agreements. They seem to have thought this through as best as you possibly could, I think, right now, because they're trying something that really is quite new and untested, and they are treating it as an experiment, and they are employing adaptive management, maybe not to the level we'd like to see it right now, but it's still, they're going to come back and evaluate it in 7 or 8 years. And I would put my money on the fact that they will fail, but I also will put my money on that I think we will learn a lot about a strategy for starting to restore part of the system, not all of the system, but part of the system for going forward. And I believe, that they've thought it through enough at this stage through these documents anyway, and the MOUs that they're putting out there, that we've got some building blocks in place to work with going forward. So I don't have any problem, asking them to put in a conceptual model of how, they think this might work. But my gosh, all up and down the West Coast, wherever there are salmon or other fish species of economic or fisheries of economic importance, these kinds of things have been done. And each year we other than in Southeast Alaska, we tend to be trending downward and downward and downward because there are all these other stressors out there. But perhaps in this case, with these voluntary agreements, it's not going to be the silver bullet, but perhaps it'll be something that'll at least show a bit of a positive return until such time as, as we can get a silver bullet, I guess. So.
Thanks, Bob. Before Steve responds, sorry if I'm cutting you off, but I notice it's 1 minute before 11, and Anna's going to have to go. So Anna, I just would like you to weigh in real quick if you had any concerns, or if you're feeling generally comfortable with, maybe a slightly modified version moving forward.
I'm
You're not
generally
voting.
comfortable. Yeah, I'm generally comfortable. I also, since I'm going to sign off, I want to mention I may be able to sign back in a half hour. I don't know if that would be helpful or productive, or if I guess, Lisa, would you prefer that I sign back in a half hour if I can, or would that just be more disruptive than helpful?
No, please do. I can't guarantee how long we'll be online. If no one's here, you'll know, you'll have your answer,
Okay.
but yeah, please do.
Okay, but yes, no, nothing major to bring up before I sign off.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Steve, did you want to offer any specific language? And I do have just one more comment before you do. Just having just been at the integrated modeling meeting, I do know that we're probably well beyond conceptual models with the salmon. I think Bob was saying the same thing too. There's a lot of really deep modeling. It's just that it's a complex system, and maybe, they tend to leave out certain things that they don't understand very well. So I think it's more we're living in a world where they have a decent modeling system, and it's just a matter of them thinking about what's missing from the models as a way to deepen their understanding. But Steve, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting they start from ground zero. I was suggesting that they look at what they're proposing as an example. The big question again, the balance between rearing and or spawning habitat area versus changes in flow relative to the salmon, and things like that. And if they can't address that directly, then what are the missing elements in that particular thing? And the other factors that we brought up before in terms of temperature, I think, which is often related to flow. And then as you move down the species list, things get further and further less information available. I think, and I'm not sure exactly how to say this, maybe we have said it in terms of managing expectations of what might be the results of this, and to have a framework that they're using to evaluate the adaptive management questions, to set up the questions and evaluate the answers. Habitat suitability, for example, was listed. That has many different definitions. And I think that, but having it be just recognizing and admitting up front of the limitations, what's going on, and managing expectations. And sorry, I can't. Is part of it. And it's maybe buried in there. Maybe we need to say it more explicitly. But it's just something that I'm not sure is really there yet.
Okay, well, we need some specific language because we might be voting on content approval. We do need some specific language. So I was proposing that let's see what Bob has to say.
No, again, we're going to say the same thing. Steve, if you have some specific language that you would like to see added to it, by all means, send it along, and we'll take a look and try our best, to blend it in. I think what you're speaking to, Steve, is actually in there, but it doesn't. They don't say it as clearly, or they don't articulate it as clearly as perhaps you have done this morning. So if you have a few sentences that we can add, then let's do it. And, it wouldn't hurt to have them at all by any means, and would probably help them a lot.
Tanya.
I wonder if one place we could tweak some of the language could be on that point about the SMART objectives, and the I think it's point number 2 in our main points on the framework, to really, maybe it's already in there, but to really emphasize the uncertainty in particular around the habitat restoration efforts, or the habitat side of this, where they seem to really acknowledge in the supplement that that's where the science is most limited, and at least from a quantitative perspective. Yet there's a lot of hand waving to say, well, there's literature to say this is all good, but they don't have any good quantitative kind of rationale to back that up. So could that be added into that section, or maybe make that point a little stronger? Would that,
I think that makes a lot of sense, honestly. So I do think that having the appropriate concepts behind the criteria they're measuring is probably the best they can do to address Steve's concern. I mean, they basically do have their conceptual relationships in there, in the sense of we're assuming there is some substitutability between rearing, habitat, and flow. They've made that pretty clear. So then the question is, how will you test whether that's true? And I think we're just not seeing enough detail to make sure we're feeling comfortable with that. So I think this would be an appropriate place to add something. That's my 2 cents. And then I think, and I don't know if there's really another point about modeling. So what I'm boiling down your comments, Steve, into is, you need the right people on board to make sure you're thinking this through carefully. But then if you're going to turn it over to, say, an analyst to look at, did we succeed, that you might need a more complex model than you already have. Because I could definitely see a lot of hand waving, right? So you're expecting the salmon to go up, but they go down, and then you start looking for excuses, and you'll probably find them. And so it's so hard to tell when you're achieving restoration goals, especially in the short term. I think we all know that systems are so variable. Fish stocks are incredibly variable, even without a lot of stressors. So these are very difficult questions, and I think that's why we just doubled down here. Tanya, did you have any specific wording you were thinking of, or should we just? Yeah,
No,
it's hard to do on the fly. Yeah,
brainstorming here.
Yeah, Bob.
Well, I would just say you're dealing with complex systems, and you're absolutely right, Lisa. It's going to go up, it's going to go down, and even with the life cycle models where they're just focusing on salmon, there's just so much uncertainty in those for both, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. I just can't, and they've been working on them for 20, 25 years now, and they're still not there. Anyway, I think they have set it up, in my opinion, they've set it up in a way that they're going to try something new. They're going to try these voluntary agreements. They're going to do it through flow as well as habitat. And you're right, the models are not there, or the evidence is not there to support the habitat right now. But maybe 7 or 8 years from now, when they evaluate this, there will be some quantitative evidence to say either yes or no that habitat restoration will work. If they treat it as a carefully thought out experiment, we'll have more information in a few years on this part. And so I'm inclined, if you want to add some things about uncertainty about models and so on, I'm inclined to put it in. But I think these are also, from what I can judge from what I've read from their documents, these are smart people who have thought about a lot of things, a lot of the aspects of the system. And I think there comes a time where we just have to rely on, are they smart enough?
Well, and if I could just add to that real quickly, I think what we see sometimes in the restoration work that's going on is there's not necessarily as thorough monitoring or other things as we'd like, and as thorough analysis of the data they collect. So I think we have in the back of our minds this concern of sometimes you under-resource this stuff. You might know what you're supposed to do, or maybe you don't hold your feet to the fire with smart metrics. So I think it's still worth saying that, even though they're really smart people and they know probably more about what could go wrong than we do. So
one would hope.
Yeah. Okay, Tom, and then Diane.
Yeah. I think I'll call it tweaking, but it's more than that, that we've discussed is good. But I think it would be important to get this thought further up in the report, maybe in the general comments, and just have a very short paragraph that talks about don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and raise some of these issues there, because it is a general problem rather than bits and pieces of the others.
That's a good point. Yeah, Diane.
One suggestion, again, a minor tweak for the benefits, where we discuss the benefits of having the scientific team in place from the beginning, is to also point out that the scientific team would then have established connections to some of the other investigations that are going on, such as the HABs. So not that you would HABs issue, not that you would need a HABs expert on this, but you would have identified who is the person in the team that's supposed to be keeping track of this issue and communicating with others in the system who are tracking that.
Okay, Bob gave a thumbs up, so, okay. All right, we have at least one public comment on this, so why don't we take that and see where if that changes our thought processes. Go ahead, Edmund.
Yes, this is Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a really important bit of legal and regulatory history here, which unfortunately you weren't provided with. But the Central Valley Project Improvement Act of 1992 directed reclamation to modify Central Valley project operations to provide flows of suitable quality, quantity, and timing to protect all life stages of anadromous fish. And reclamation was supposed to dedicate 800,000 acre feet of project yield to that purpose. So there was an independent review panel which wrote a report called Listen to the River. And the panel expected to find that implementation of that water dedicated in statute to protecting life stages of salmon was managed this way. They identify 800,000 feet of dedicated storage in the system, essentially a water budget for salmon, and then consistent with an identified system flow regime to improve conditions for anadromous fish, reclamation releases the stored water in requested amounts at the call of the fish managers, and then protect that amount of altered flow through the rivers, through the Delta, and into the bay. And the panel said, we were flabbergasted to learn this is not how agencies implement this provision. The agencies have not identified a system-wide flow regime instead of system flow objectives. Worse, reclamation does not dedicate and manage 800,000 acre feet of water from headwaters storage through the Delta. And they go on to more details about how reclamation releases water upstream and then diverts it out of the system when it's at the Delta pumps. And so this was in 1995 for the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan update. There was a big discussion about requiring in regulation how they managed the water that's dedicated to the ecosystem. Instead, there was a narrative salmon doubling requirement based on adaptive management. And the narrative requirement said water quality conditions shall be maintained together with other measures in the watershed sufficient to achieve a doubling of natural production of Chinook salmon from the average production of 1967 to 1991, consistent with the provisions of state and federal law. And state law requires that the salmon doubling requirement be met now, not 1965. And this is a point of contention for the salmon fishing industry, which there was low enough returns, they're probably going to shut down the salmon fishing industry again this year. So this adaptive management isn't new, and it was part of the 1995 water quality control plan. And they would promise to do 100,000 acres of habitat restoration upstream and in the Delta, and it was going to, and then they would provide extra flows if necessary. So this is why environmental and fishing groups are somewhat skeptical about adaptive management and these programs that promise benefits, because they've been through the we'll figure out later if the fish really need more flows since 1995. And the Delta smelt is now on verge of extinction. Longfin smelt aren't very far behind. Another pelagic fish, striped bass populations have crashed and never recovered. Winter Run got just totally hammered. Winter Run Chinook during the drought, and the salmon fishery is closing for the second time. So I just wanted to make you aware of this history, and I'll send you some background information.
Thank you, Deirdre. Any other comments or questions for Deirdre? Okay, well, I'll take a look at what you send. I think we do understand that the fish are not doing well, and things have been tried and promises were made. We have a general understanding of that, but I guess the issue may be, what's the best way to move forward from here, given all the challenges of the balance that we've been talking about. So yeah, it's not our job to decide what that balance should be, just to look at the science. So, okay. So on that, if I may just segue to my comment, a very minor comment, really, I guess I would maybe just like a sentence added somewhere in the beginning about what the flow of ideas is, because I'm not completely unsure. I'm not sure why we keep moving back and forth between the MOU and the scientific supplement. If it seems a little bit disjointed to me, maybe there was a thought of these are the most important points down to the less important points, but if we could just say that, or possibly reorganize a bit so that the comments are distinguished by document, would be my suggestion. Yeah, Bob, what's your response to that?
Actually, I thought that from the beginning. I had thought of these as basically one whole document. But, there's the scientific supplement and MOU, but originally when I started drafting this, I kind of took them as a whole and came up with my own comments, and then received comments from others. And rather than trying to separate them as we have done in this document, my suggestion is wherever possible, just to treat it as one whole document, one whole idea. We're talking about voluntary agreements, of which there are perhaps two parts to it, the MOU and the science supplement, but I don't see that we have to differentiate them, in our review unless it's absolutely necessary. So I would say just blend it into one.
Okay, any other thoughts? Okay, well, hearing none, it's not something I think prevents the document from being readable, but I think because different people probably worked on the two different documents, I think we should at least maintain what we have in terms of referring to which document we're talking about. But maybe you could just add a sentence at the end of the introduction that explains what the flow is, I think would be helpful. Lauren, you have a suggestion?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that the authors of the two documents are different. As Bob, it was Tom, I think, pointed out, the authors of the supplement were representatives of three agencies. My understanding, and I don't know exactly the correct wording, but the MOU has signatories, a number of signatories. So the parties to the voluntary agreements, and I would attribute the MOU to them as authors. So there are two different sets of authors and two different roles that those two documents play in the process. So they are not one and the same, and they're related, of course, but they're not one document with two parts.
Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, I think that's consistent with what I was saying too. Yeah, Steve, you have a suggestion?
Yeah, I think going back to Tom's original suggestion, as long as we don't use the word authors and we talk about science supplement, or we talk about the MOU. And I think it's pretty clear when we do that. And then as far as the flow, we have general comments on the science supplement, then general comments on the MOU, and then we go into concerns and specific topics. We could just combine those first two sections and just say, general comments, but within the sentence, topic sentence, we clarify which one we're talking about. I don't see it's too difficult. I cannot see, if we were to do the science supplement solely for itself, we would say it totally lacks adaptive management framework in a quantitative scientific way, and the answer is, well, all of that's buried in that MOU somewhere. So I think up front we say we looked at both of those because of that reason, and that move on from there. I would follow up with, I think Bob's suggestion is, or somebody's suggestion, we should early on add a paragraph about the using this as a recognizing the uncertainties and the assumptions, and what they're really trying to do overall is that it should be set up and treated as if it was an experiment. And then I think we can put that paragraph sort of right up in the very first part of the document I reviewed.
Just to clarify, Steve, so that paragraph would be about clarifying that we looked at both documents and making the major point about uncertainties. That seemed a little.
I'm sorry. I'm dealing with two separate topics. First topic one, distinguishing between MOU and scientific basis report. I think that as long as we just deal with stating what we're talking about, get rid of the word authors, and stating what we're talking about, and maybe eliminating the subheadings of general comments on the MOU and general comments on the scientific basis report, just say general comments, then I think we're okay, because there's general comments, overarching concerns, and then discussion on specific topics, and then editorial comments. I think the flow follows very clearly. Second, completely different topic is to follow up on what we were talking about before, in terms of the overarching goal of this is to balance flow with habitat restoration, and talk about the uncertainties, but say that overall we recognize this, but we recommend setting up the whole process as and treat it as an experiment, and maybe make a suggestion as the modeling and things like that, and quantifying stuff, but put the comments I made earlier into those very introductory remarks. I don't have a third topic.
Praise be. Okay, so I would just like to say that because different people will be responsible for looking at our comments, I would not endorse the idea to remove the headings about, first we're going to talk about the MOU, then we're going to talk about just because it may make perfect sense to you, but I think it really helps the reader to see, okay, now we're talking about this document. Okay, now we're talking about this document. It could get a little tedious to keep saying, oh, and this paragraph's about this paragraph's about this. So that I just feel like as long as it isn't too offensive to you, I would like to keep those headings. Bob, give you a chance, and then Steve.
Follow up on that just finally.
Yeah. Okay.
All the rest of our stuff, overarching Delta concerns and all of the rest of those, we interchangeably talk about the scientific report and MOU. They talk about them both. The first one of overarching concerns, MOUs in the first line of the document. So I think the overarching concern and the specific topics apply to both of those documents. But anyway.
Well, you raise a good point that we're inconsistent. I would actually rather see things divided up more, but trying to find what works here. Bob, do you have a comment?
I would just say there's, Steve and yourself, Lisa, and Diane, and others, you've all had very good comments. I would encourage you to, take the document as it is right now and add your sentences or paragraphs where you'd like to see them, and then I can work with them to, come up with a final version that hopefully everyone would like. Well, I think
Well,
that,
Bob, I know that would be the preferred process, but because of the short timeline, the goal here is to like verbally say what changes we would make, especially if there's any substance to them. We don't have to debate the headings now. I think the group would probably be comfortable with somebody making a choice and just making it make sense. But in terms of any substantive comments, like if we're going to recommend a model be developed or something like that, we need to say it now so that we can get content approval so that we can get this in as quickly as possible. So I appreciate that would be a better way to work, but unfortunately we're a little constrained because our goal was to basically get this in this, today, or this week. So we have very little time. We won't be able to meet again to approve a new version. So.
well, no, I think, what you're saying, Lisa, is fine. I'm just suggesting that, we ask for approval on content now pending some changes, but it would help, in making those changes to have the verbiage from the individuals is all. And then I can very quickly get this done. I could have it to you tomorrow morning if everyone would do that right after this meeting. Just send, write down the edits that they would like to see, and I'll work on it right away.
Okay, great. That's great. Yeah, I think, we're on the same page. That certainly is how we'll proceed, but we do need to verbally understand what any substantive changes are going to be. So, okay. So yeah, Diane.
I just wanted to say I won't have time this afternoon to do any edits, but I think, Bob, you understand where I was suggesting some text. So I completely think you could add what I had in mind.
You're delegated. Okay. All right. Well, at this point, let's just say, are there any other overarching concerns? And we'll check in again, make sure there's no public comments in a second. So any other issues people want to raise? All right. Hearing none. Oh, yeah. Oh, well, we'll double check on that. But okay. So the things, Edmund, do you want to recap what the changes are? Should I?
Yeah, I can do a brief recap if you
Why don't
like
you do
for
that?
now.
Yeah, that'd be good. I don't want to forget something.
Yes. So one of the first comments was from Tom, was to change the authors. So right now the current review list is authors. The suggestion was to make it scientific supplement or MOU to make it less personal, and that should be a simple change. The other comment was from Diane. In the scientific basis report, the VAs are written as like a HABs-free ecosystem, which is not the case. And there's a need to highlight this in the review. The other comments were from Steve about the current quantitative capabilities are not there to achieve what the VAs are intended to achieve. Like, for example, there's uncertainty on if they can measure what they want to measure. There may or may not be able to identify any signals of change due to stressors. And there was different ideas of how to address this comment, which the lead authors can decide upon based off of feedback from today if there's agreement, such as the need to consider a conceptual framework. I know there's mixed views on that. And also in the second statement on the MOU, where we mentioned the SMART objectives, this came from Tanya, to better highlight the uncertainties. And then the other suggestion from Tom and from Steve was to just put it up front as part of the introductory materials about uncertainties and how the VAs are like a grand experiment. I think that's where we kind of landed based off Steve's comments. So there's different areas that could be modified. Before I move on, is there anything that anyone would like to add in terms of how to address Steve's comments?
I would
All
like
right.
what Steve prefers.
Okay. Noted. Then there was also a comment from Diane regarding the comments where we mentioned the scientific team in the review. Her suggestion is to also add things to effect that the scientific team should be able to establish connections of what is going on in the region. Like, for example, someone who's focused on HABs and knows who to talk to about HABs and also knows what is currently going on in the region related to HABs. And the final comment I have in terms of agreed about changes was perhaps there needs to be a statement on the structure of the review, so people know how it goes back and forth between MOU and scientific supplement. But I think the overall comment is editorial in that the leads will work to restructure or modify the review for clarity purposes, based off the fact that the MOU and scientific supplement have different audiences. Did I miss anything, or is there anything that people would like to add?
I think that captures it pretty well. I don't have any other points in my notes, but maybe just to the last point you said about Diane, and something Steve said too, was just, really making sure you have the right expertise. And so whether that's networking with local experts or developing a team with the sufficient expertise. So that's a pretty minor point, but just making sure we get that down. Anything else? Okay, well, go ahead, Tanya.
Well, it seems like we haven't quite resolved what Steve was trying to communicate and where we would put those points. And I think before we vote, we need to at least clarify, are we going to add a paragraph to the beginning? Are we going to, what's 2 paragraphs? What would you like to see, Steve, so that we could, I think, vote on the content?
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I would suggest adding a paragraph towards the beginning somewhere, just a paragraph, and because it seems to be a general comment.
That sounds like it'll work. It's yeah, that seemed to be where we evolved to. Tanya, did you want to?
Oh, I just want to make sure we have clarity on what's in that paragraph.
Okay.
Is that a comment?
Bob, yeah, go ahead. All right, finish. Did you want to say something, Tanya, about what should or shouldn't go in that paragraph?
No, I heard a couple different things from Steve, and so I just wanted to make sure we know what's going in that paragraph.
Bob, would you like to articulate what you see going into that paragraph?
No, I think I was going to ask, well, I know I was going to ask that Steve pen that paragraph and send it right away. And I'll work with it to blend it into the document. Nobody can say it as well as Steve can say it at this point.
Of course, I'm going to vote it down with that as a, if that's included. I unfortunately, if you haven't noticed, I'm on a boat and I have no time to do this until Monday morning. So I am more than happy to trust Bob to write it as long as he doesn't use the word authors in the paragraph, and happy to review it first thing Monday morning and add whatever text if needed at all. I think Bob has the same, my impression is he has the same understanding, and he's the one who's also been using the word, I wrote it down, set it up in a way and treat it as an experiment. Those are Bob's words. And I think that I'd be happy to trust him to do the first cut on it.
I'm not quite sure what to write, Steve, though. I can talk about it as an experiment and, but I'm not quite sure what 2 or 3 sentences would be.
Yeah, I can do it, but the earliest I can get to it is sometime this weekend, not today.
Well, I think we just want to understand, let's not wordsmith, but let's just say what are our main points. So what I was hearing was we talk about this, being cognizant of the fact that this is a grand experiment and treating it as such, which means making sure you're collecting the right kind of data to make sense of to make sure we learn from it is what I heard. And then the other thing being make other appropriate either connections to expertise or other monitoring investments that would allow us to understand confounding drivers of the system would be one way to say it. Just, your idea that to tease out the signal from the noise, we may not have we would like to see evidence that they're thinking about it that way, that, understanding that it's a complex system and developing the needed expertise for models to make sense of the results, something like that. Does that cover what you're saying?
Basically, is that sort of the overarching scientific objective underlying science is to balance flows versus habitat restoration. And we really don't have the adequate, in my view, the adequate science to be able to balance those in a quantitative way. We don't understand how many acres of rearing habitat is equivalent to how many CFS for a particular species. We just don't understand those relationships enough to make those quantifiable, which is partially recognized in the document itself, but it needs to be explicitly recognized, and that therefore there are many assumptions related to these relationships, assumptions of flow versus abundance, of assumptions of habitat acreage versus changes in abundance or production, and and that's to be recognized, and that's the limitations of the science. Therefore, since we're going to be changing flows and acreage, that this ought to be treated as a set up in a way and treated as an experiment. So we can begin to evolve, do it within the concept of a scientific of a model, and set it up in such a way that we can begin to perhaps even address some of these relationships, or at least understand when that the changes that occurred, understand better to explain what caused them. And and I'm not saying this very well is that the recognize we don't know what we need to know in order to do this. Recognize that, state our assumptions clearly, and say, therefore, we're going to do this in a way that we consider as an experiment. Set it up a modeling framework, run it as an experiment. We can improve which is what one does as an adaptive management framework, is an experiment. Set it up in that context and be able to evolve the science as part of this overall project. Anyway.
Okay, so what I'm hearing. So first of all, I don't think we can wait till Monday to finalize this. We'd like to ideally finalize it today, or I don't know if our staff is working over the weekend, but today or tomorrow, I think, is the goal. So I think, what you said was very helpful. Like, basically you want to just set this up as, there are these uncertainties, perhaps they're recognized, but really that's our motivation for making all these comments about the adaptive management process and making sure you have the right expertise and you're considering the uncertainties. Don't you think that setting up that you just did is just a nice way to frame the recommendations that we make in the body? You're not really making any fundamentally different recommendations, right? It's just you need to understand this is an experiment, and that's why we're making these recommendations. Do people think that's appropriate?
See, I thought it was the document was already set up that way, but perhaps not as clear as Steve would like. I can certainly, based on what you just said, Steve, I can certainly, put in a few sentences right at the beginning to try and clarify that point. Bring it home a little bit clearer than perhaps it is now.
Yeah, maybe it's, to me, it's not the scientific expertise. To me, it's the maybe the more forceful recognition up front of the limitations of the available understanding of the system, and therefore we're going to do the best we can. We're going to assume these relationships exist. We're going to assume this. We're going to assume there's some. If you wipe out, if you save one part of the life cycle, you're therefore not going to wipe out any other part of the life cycle. It's just sort of like, it's like temperature, now I'm not going to get into that, but if you heat the temperature up to 25 degrees, you're going to kill all salmon, no matter how much acreage you have out there, things like that. So I think there's there's it's recognizing that you're comparing two drivers that you really don't understand the relationships of how they relatively impact. Maybe you do in salmon. There might be more to know in salmon, but certainly not in many of the other species. And just recognizing it up front. They recognize it in chapter 7 or something like that, that there's uncertainties. I would say recognize it right up front. This is all part of what we're doing, and we realize that we don't have all the science and data that we would love to have to be able to make quantitative predictions of what the results of our actions are going to be.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I can say I can do that.
Okay, and then it does look like, we could give Steve opportunity to look and edit on Monday if there's enough slack in the schedule for that. Diane, what was your comment?
Well, I wanted to say that we don't want to, I think at least, we don't want to go too far towards emphasizing how little we know, because I think we also know enough to forge ahead or to be advocates for these voluntary agreements as a step forward. So it's not very challenging to do predictions, but somehow having a balance in this introductory paragraph to not undercut the whole process. Because I do like the tone of what was written so far as by all means go for it, sort of as an underlying tone that this kind of approach is worth pursuing.
Yeah, that's very consistent with my perspective as well. Just that it's worth doing. Just make sure you learn from it. That's, I think, what should be our main message. Steve.
Yeah, I guess I agree, and I think I'm certainly happy to look at whatever Bob does. To me, I don't know if getting it out at 4 o'clock today on a Friday afternoon is going to really have a lot of people reading it over the weekends. Getting it out first thing Monday morning is probably not going to make a huge difference to the in terms of time frame.
Yeah, we said, maybe you didn't hear me, but I said you would have time to look at it on Monday. It's not a problem. Okay, good. Well then, if folks are feeling comfortable with that content, I would seek a motion to approve this. Diane?
I would be glad to move that we approve the content as described by Edmund in terms of revisions or changes.
Do we have a second?
I second it.
Excellent. Okay, before we vote, we go to public comment. Edmund, do we have any public comments? I'm not hearing you, Edmund.
Sorry. There are currently no public comments, but let's just give a few seconds in case anyone would like to raise their hand via Zoom to provide their public comments.
And I'll just take this second to thank Bob for being willing to jump on this and get it done. We do have such a tight timeline.
All right. I currently don't see any written comments by email or any raised hands via Zoom.
All right. In that case, we will move to a roll call vote. Bob.
I approve.
I thought you'd say that. Steve.
I approve.
Virginia.
I approve, and I should say, I'm sorry, we have high winds and tornadoes here, and so I would have approved the last one too, but I got cut out right as the vote was occurring.
Yeah, we noticed that. Sorry, Virginia. Tanya.
I approve.
Tom.
I approve.
Anna's not here. Diane.
I approve.
Obey.
I approve.
And Lisa here, I approve. Okay, so it's unanimous approval that Bob will add in the changes that we discussed today and generate a new version that will be proofread by Steve on Monday, and then go to be sent in to the Corps of Engineers the State Water Board as soon as possible. Getting confused on my two documents. Okay, so then I think we just have one other agenda item. Well, no, except for reviewing things, but yeah, one other thing is just to make sure people are ready for the upcoming in-person meeting. So that's going to be March 27th through the 29th. We're going to receive a council report, a Delta lead scientist report, and we will, at this time, we'll get updates on all the review efforts that are progressing, and we'll be preparing a presentation to the DPC about how we are going to, the council. We're going to prepare a report to the council on our plans for the year. And it'll be really important to have that conversation if the board is comfortable with how all the reviews are moving forward. Did somebody say something? Do you want to add something? Okay. And then we will have a DPC presentation on how Delta communities responded to or were impacted by the recent storms, which we asked for. And then on day 2, we will have a tour focused on agricultural practices in the region. And then what other things that are coming up after our meeting are that we're planning potentially a decision-making under deep uncertainty kickoff seminar in April. And we'll tell you more about it at the meeting. And then in May, we have potentially a boat tour planned, another in-person meeting, and perhaps an in-person meeting on the DMDU. All this is still being finalized. And so that is what is on the agenda for the foreseeable future. Now we have, Edmund's just going to give us a review of items for follow-up. Getting the agencies right, I assume, unlike me.
Yeah, and just for the record, there were no public comments for preparation for future meetings agenda item. But for the items for follow-up at today's meeting, a motion was made, and then a motion was made by Tanya and seconded by Diane to approve the content of the EIS with suggested edits. Would you like me to recap the suggested edits again? I know we already did it beforehand, but do you want another recap, Lisa?
I think the EIS was straightforward enough that we don't need it, but perhaps do that for the VA.
Okay. So the motion was approved and accepted with the suggested edits, and Dr. Werner will go ahead and make those edits, and we'll submit it to the Army Corps by the comment deadline, which currently is March 16th. For the VA's review, a motion was made by Diane and seconded by Tom to approve the content of the current draft with suggested edits, and I'll just recap the agreed upon suggested edits. The first is to change authors to scientific supplement or MOU. The second was to make sure to mention that the VAs are written in the HABs-free ecosystem and highlight HAB concerns in the review. The third one is to address some of the items that Steve brought up related to uncertainty and how the current capabilities, the quantitative capabilities of what the VAs are trying to achieve might not be there. And there's a need to highlight how the VAs are one grand experiment, and they can measure what they want to measure, but they may not be able to identify signals of stressors due to stressors. So the idea was that there will be some introductory paragraph related to this issue in the review. I know I kind of jumbled that, so hopefully it'll be clearer in the note. The next item was for the comments on the scientific team to include Diane's part about making sure there's the right expertise for that team to establish those kinds of connections. Then there was a comment about the structure of the review. That will be modified, but at the minimum, there needs to be some sort of statement up front of how the review is structured. Did I capture the suggested edits appropriately?
You do, based on my notes, getting thumbs up from most of the folks who made comments. So that sounds good.
All right, and the idea is that Bob will address the edits from today, get it to Steve for review on Monday, and then hopefully it'll be submitted by the water board soon after. All right, this concludes our follow-up items, and since there is a public comment, if you want me to take the public comments on this too,
Yeah,
Dr.
go ahead.
Winger.
Yeah.
All right. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, this is actually kind of on the previous item, but I really strongly support the board making a formal presentation to the Delta Stewardship Council about their plans for the year and also any resources they might need. I went back and looked at the history of the board was essentially defunded when there were all these COVID budget cuts. And we are in another adverse budget environment. So I really think being clear and proactive about what your plans are and what your resources needs are is important. And I also really think with accelerating climate change and the deep uncertainty that the board has a huge amount to contribute. And I also appreciate the way everybody dug in and did all the work on these reviews. It's quite a lot to take on when you're only getting up to speed. And I'm keeping abreast of the budget negotiations, and I'll let you know if there's anything that comes across my radar screen that might affect the ISB. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Appreciate your interest in what we do. Okay, so I think then we are ready to wrap up. Let me just double check if I was supposed to do anything else.
Public comments not on the agenda.
Right. Do we have any public comments not on the agenda? For items not on the agenda.
Yeah, we have one from Deirdre Dan. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
There we go. So I just wanted to say I did discuss maybe getting the environmental groups, and I said, you need to give a little more background to the Delta ISB and try to be in communication with them more. I don't have the bandwidth to do the kind of intensive work they're doing, looking at current operations and how they're impacting fish. And there was huge concern during the drought about management of water in reservoirs and how adversely it impacted salmon. Fortunately, we're going into what looks like a really wet year. We don't know how long this will last, but at least for right now, it looks really good. So I'm just letting you know that I indicated to them that I think trying to get you some background information is important, and I'll try and help facilitate that to the extent I can.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. All right, well, with that, I'll just make one little closing comment. For all of you folks who are leading reviews, we do really need things to be in good shape by the next meeting so that I can make a very clear presentation to the council about why we're doing what we're doing. And plus, of course, we really want to get our perspective out there so that we can hear from our stakeholders about whether we're answering questions they're concerned about and how we might adapt what we're thinking to their needs. So for all those reasons, I hope folks are going to have fairly completed prospectuses by the next meeting or as close as possible so that we can just have a nice discussion about those plans. Okay, well, with that, I will adjourn the meeting. And thank you all for your time. Good work today. We've approved both the motions and we're going to move forward. Thanks.
Bye-bye.